Perfect, Brian. So we shall begin now, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. First, good evening to everybody in Peru. Well, good morning to Brian in Australia. We are going to begin today a conference titled How Peru and Australia can unlock its potential amidst a changing in global order. I am really glad to present today Mr. Brian Chu. I will read just a short CV of him, and then we will let him give his presentation. Brian Chu is the founding director of the Australian Gold Fund, a private investment trust focusing on gold mining companies and precious metal. He's also the gold investment analyst at Melbourne-based Fat Tail Investment Research, an affiliate of international publisher De Agora. In capacity, he is the editor of Gold Investment Newsletter Service with a readership of over 10,000 paid subscribers. Brian has a broad range of experience arising from a career in academia for over 2 decades while maintaining ties with the corporate industry. He was a lecturer in the School of Risk and Actuarial Studies at University of New South Wales, as well as a contract teaching and research academic and at SPA Jane International College of Global Management, a business school at Macquarie University, Alpha Crucis College, Macquarie University International College, the Sinded Institute of Business and Technology, and the Victoria Institute of Australia. He has taught in almost all disciplines in commerce, actuarial studies, accounting, economics, finance, and statistics. So it really is very interesting to have Brian Chu. Specifically, he's going to talk about Peru and Australia, as we will see from his presentation, our 2 countries, even if we're very far apart. We're talking just with Brian about that. The Pacific Ocean divided us, but we share many similarities. And it's very interesting because we don't know so much as Australia. I was telling Brian that next year we're going to celebrate 60 years of diplomatic relation. We don't know so much each other, but we are increasingly related to us. We have signed a free trade agreement, I guess 2-3 years ago. We're also a member of several international organizations. We're talking just about the Asia Pacific Economic Organization, and we have just been members of the so-called CPTPP, this new Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that have now 11 countries. So I will give the floor to Brian Chu. Please, Brian, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Carlos, and good evening to our audience. I appreciate you taking your time to join me in this, especially given that for most of you, this is dinner time. And some of you would probably want to be off doing something else rather than listening to this presentation. But nevertheless, it is an honor for me to be able to join in and talk about this. Now, before I start, one thing that I want to clarify is that international trade is not my area of expertise in terms of that's not the career path that I've joined. But I'm looking at this from more from a strategic, like a geopolitical strategic perspective, as well as also from in economic and financial markets perspective, because my background is in resource investments, as well as looking at geopolitical developments internationally, especially in what's happening around the world in these uncertain times. So my presentation today, I'm going to cover these key areas. It will be firstly to talk about the global context, especially now we are entering into unusual times as the existing world order, which one would call the liberal world order or globalism. I believe we are seeing the coming of the end of this, which may be surprising to some of you who may believe otherwise. And I'll talk about my perspective as to why I believe this is the case. We're then going to move on to looking more closely at existing trade relationships between Peru and Australia. And then I'm going to look at what types of challenges and what types of potential we have going forward especially given that both Peru and Australia, in my understanding, are resource-rich countries, and in our own geographic region, we are actually leaders on some of the most sought after resources, and therefore there are similarities that we can actually leverage off, especially because one would say Australia, in terms of economic and technological developments, Australia is more advanced than Peru, but it also means that Peru has the benefit of looking at Australia as an example on what Peru can do better, and what types of mistakes or things that Australia has done which Peru can avoid following the same path. Then I'm going to leave some time for questions and answers. So hopefully within this time, I'll be able to cover all this, because you'll see in my presentation slides, it's quite packed with content. So I'll do my best to try to keep within the time limit. So first thing is, why do I believe that there is a fall of the globalism or the liberal world order? Now, most of you, I hope, are aware of what the liberal world order is. It is actually the way the nations around the world have been interacting with each other. I believe going back to probably around World War II era, like post-World War II era, where you have the international, we had the Cold War, but so the difference between the West and the East was, the West was more symbolized by a liberal democracy, where people would vote in their governments, their representatives, to run the country on their behalf, whereas the countries in the East were more or less, so we're talking about Asia and the former USSR, Soviet Union, and also even in Africa, where they were hereditary monarchies, or they may be authoritarian regimes where the leader was actually installed perhaps by the military, or they were appointed by a previous colony. So how did the liberal world order come to be? It was because, of course, the Allies won in World War II, and therefore the strength, you could say, of the internationally, democracies or constitutional republics where the people had the ability to vote on a country with a set constitution or fixed laws, they seem to prevail, and they dictated the way world trade and the direction of the world worked. And that's why you had increasing number of countries post-World War II in Asia and Africa that sought to be independent, and some countries developed into democracies or republics where people would vote for their leader, while some others remained relatively authoritarian and had a leader who basically weren't required to go through elections. Now, this order worked very well for quite a number of years, as we saw the economic prosperity, especially the growth in the 1960s to the 1990s. And then we had the subprime crisis at the time. We had 9/11. We had the subprime crisis, which people call the global financial crisis. The reason why I don't call it the global financial crisis is because I believe there is actually another one that's happening right now. As we are aware that the central banks around the world have been raising interest rates almost in coordination, and we are experiencing a slowdown in the financial markets, which was also accelerated by the fact that we had the coronavirus global pandemic at the beginning of 2020, all the way till even now. We're only recently starting to open up. All these things have actually shown key vulnerabilities in the international governance system, where you had nations that govern themselves, but on top of that, you have international bodies such as the United Nations, the World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, and the World whatever organizations. They dictated to many national leaders as to how to manage their affairs, foreign affairs, or even intervene in military conflicts and also internal civil unrest. I believe that system is actually failing because the central banking system, which we're seeing, where the economy is driven by central banks and monetary policies, that's caused rampant inflation as a result of both the legacy of central banks coming to rescue governments and the governments bailing out banks or failing businesses in the previous financial crises. So rampant inflation just is actually exposing the weakness of Keynesian economics, which is basically like demand-driven economic growth, driven by debt, which has actually interests attached on top of it. There are also other things that the liberal world order is failing, and it's because it's destroyed public trust. What have we seen? We've seen the World Health Organization's mismanagement and also politicization of the coronavirus outbreak. The fact that we have actually seen changing narratives, science not based on science, such as the use of lockdowns, the use of face masks, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, etc., which we actually are increasingly seeing aren't particularly effective in controlling the outbreaks in many parts of the world when you're lining up with countries that have used strict mandates. So it seems like there is there is corruption setting in. There is also abuse of power where those in power have basically told the world what they should do, and when things are not according to what they plan, instead of actually walking back and admitting failure, they have instead doubled down. And not only that, we are actually seeing an increase in the release of documents, leaking of documents where these organizations have actually colluded and basically behind closed doors, they have actually entered into agreements into controlling information, into ensuring that their views are accepted and every other dissenting view is being demonized. So these things are actually coming out, and the reason why some of this may not sound apparent to you may also be because the existing media complex we have around the world, whether it's US media or whether it's your own local media, they are also acting in collaboration to try to minimize information that's inconvenient to a narrative. Now, there is also something which is also called wokeism, which is what we would call, it's a weaponized form of social and corporate activism where people, where you have public figures who are pushing certain agendas such as equality agenda, the green agenda, etc., where while those people are in public showing what people should do, they are actually not doing this in their own private lives. Example is and I'll talk a little bit more about later on the green agenda, where you have all these leaders who are talking about saving the environment. They're actually flying around the world in private jets, whereas telling people not to travel. So in a way, it doesn't really sit well. It's hypocrisy. And the worst bit is they're actually monetizing it. They're gaining public recognition and potentially gaining donors' funds through pushing these types of agenda. So when you have the combination of economic failure, policy failures, and exposure of hypocrisy, I believe that type of the influence should over time decline. and give way to another force, which I believe is coming. And we can talk about a bit of that later on. And now the next thing I want to talk about is the fall of the liberal world order also would lead to the global supply chain moving or transitioning into a different form. Now, we have actually been making use of Pareto economics over, I believe, the last 150 years, where countries increasingly moved away from being self-sufficient to becoming experts or specializing in manufacturing or providing services to countries around the world based on what their strengths, relative strengths are. Now, Pareto economics, in theory, is really good because you can think of it this way, like even in your own home, rather than everyone looking after their own, they're cooking their own meals, they're cleaning up after themselves, and they're earning their own income. We have a family member who's a breadwinner. We got someone who is an expert in taking care of the house and cooking and cleaning and looking after the house and managing the finances. So that way, people are actually, hopefully, the output is more efficient. Now that worked until in early 2020 when we had the pandemic, where we had basically a significant shutdown in global trade and even domestic production. So countries that were once reliant on other countries to produce would actually face significant shortages, or they had to pay higher prices to compete in a market where global production is down. The supply chain is slowed down due to the fact that you had so many policies, and there were increasing policies to ensure the safety, in quotation marks, of people living in this pandemic. And the mandates have caused loss of jobs, reduction in production, and we now are facing global food shortages, potentially. I believe Peru and Australia are somewhat lucky compared to other countries because both countries are actually quite strong primary producers. So to some extent, we're able to provide for our population, but that cannot be said for many other countries. The other thing that's also putting a spanner in the works, this is causing extra problems, is that amidst economic troubles, global supply chain problems, we got a green energy revolution that is trying to remove fossil fuels from the global economy, which is, in my opinion at least, is the worst possible time that these things could happen. Why? Because fossil fuels is producing about 75% of the world's electricity for the electricity consumption, plus coal, oil, nuclear, I believe, are the three key sources of baseload energy, as in energy that is reliable during like 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, as opposed to wind, solar, hydro, which are probably not as reliable, and it also depends on your geographic location. You can't build a hydroelectric dam in the middle of a desert where there's no water flowing, and there's no point building solar panels in a place where it's often cloudy and there's not much sun. So that's why us the last 250 years, 300 years since the Industrial Revolution, we saw such massive economic growth is because of our heavy reliance on fossil fuels. And to remove that before we actually have a viable alternative is actually, in my personal opinion, quite suicidal. Now, where did this whole green energy revolution come from? It comes from what I would call poorly conceived climate science. And I'll explain that a little later in terms of why I mean climate science. It's poorly conceived. It's because the problem is that if you actually go back to the fundamentals of science, a lot of what climate science is actually it bases its conclusions on, it is not. It does not sit well with, at least from my area of expertise in statistics and economics, they are not particularly logical. And in saying this, I want to actually make one thing clear. I do believe that there is a lot of opportunity for the world to move into cleaner forms of energy. I just don't believe in the way that it's implemented is currently logical or viable. The third thing that's also a reason why I believe the global supply chain we're going to have to review and reform it is because the recent Ukraine and Russia conflict is showing that not only can global military conflicts in countries where they are strategic providers, strategic exporters of key products could cause massive problems. It's that we have overused trade sanctions as a means to try to bring countries back into line, to bring some form of international harmony. As you can see, the West has adopted a trade sanctions approach to try to rein in Russia to prevent it fighting Ukraine. And that's not only failing, but it's backfiring on them, with the European Union facing massive gas shortages and also potential what one would call a dark winter in the coming months, simply because there isn't enough energy supplies to heat homes or allow businesses to run. And in many cases, your country is only as strong as your ability to feed your own family and also keep your economy going. So in this case, let's move on to the opportunities for Peru and Australia, and in light of the context that I've built in terms of how I believe the liberal world order is probably coming to an end, and we're going to have to resort to a different form of foreign trade and foreign relations. So let's firstly look into how Peru and Australia, what the trade relationships are. Now, by any measure, Peru and Australia have modest trade relations. So you could say that neither countries are on each other's top priorities in trade, even though our presentation today is looking at, it values this potential, this relationship we've got together. But the total value of trade between the two nations are just under $300 billion. And I believe it's less than 1% of global of trade, I believe, between our two countries, even not just in global terms. We're talking about in between our two countries. Our major partners in importing and exporting, of course, are China, United States, Japan, and South Korea, of which Professor Carlos pointed out to me that Peru has a long-standing trade relationship with China and Japan going back over 150, almost 150 years as a result of the opening of the Peruvian economy back in the 19th century with its trade in precious metals, which of course attracts a lot of interest to Asian nations. Now with Australia and Peru, Peru provides it's the largest exporter to Australia in terms of food pellets, which is valuable for our cattle and sheep and poultry production, as well as fish oil, which is used for, of course, health products, food products, as well as also animal feed. Peru is a major exporter of primary goods, whether it's metals or soft commodities, whereas Australia would export back to Peru processed goods, especially in mining supplies, for example, cyanides and machinery, which is valuable to Peru, especially because it's a mining intensive country. Both Australia and Peru are one of the leading producers of sought after precious metals as well as strategic metals such as copper. So in this case, I believe that the opportunities for Peru and Australia to increase trade relations exists, and I believe that it will be in the area of our primary production of resources, as well as machinery to aid in improving production, capital goods, as well as also, I believe, technology in order to increase our countries' our respective nations' productivity. So in light of our trade relations and the liberal world order falling, and also the global supply chain needing to be reconsidered, what are some of the challenges? And I would say the three key areas to look at is the relationship between Peru and Australia with China, which is the leading importer and exporter of the world. And we're also going to look at the opportunities to deal with how the global trade system itself is going to change. But firstly, let's talk about China, because that's the elephant in the room, or I would say the dragon in the room in the case of China. Both Australia and Peru are very reliant on China. It's 30% of Peruvian trade by value goes to China, whether it's imports or exports. And Peru exports primary products such as copper, iron, precious metals, lead, zinc, and also food products to China, and imports back finished goods. So in a way, you could say Peru provides the raw materials, China processes it as a factory of the world, and then exports it back to Peru. The living standards of a country is highly dependent on maintaining, firstly, healthy relationships with China, because if the relationship is not particularly good with China, then Peru has to find a different country to manufacture and export the capital goods that is capital goods, and also daily goods for daily consumption for another country. And that might not be as easy, because as we understand, the global supply chain is in quite a bit of trouble. So it's a very delicate relationship, as I'm sure you all appreciate, because China doesn't just trade, and I'll be fair to say this: no country trades with another country purely on trade. There will be, of course, discussions. There'll definitely be strings attached. It could be political cooperation. It could be favors in terms of military alliances, or a sharing of technologies and intellectual property. And what I believe is a major problem in trading with China and having foreign relations with China is that the country has blurred boundaries between what they call state-owned enterprises, as in businesses that actually have a direct relationship with the government, and also private enterprises, which basically, as we understand it in Peru and Australia, companies that are owned by private citizens, and they may or may not have relationships with the government, or they're not under the direct influence or pressures from the government. But in China, that's a blurred boundary, meaning that if you're trading with a company when you're trading with any enterprises in China, you're dealing with the government, and the government can access the data without necessarily the consent of the third party. So if you're trading with a private company in China, chances are the data that the private company has with you, from you, will actually will actually be shared with to the Chinese government. So this type of thing can be a problem because of privacy issues, as well as also you could lose your business competitiveness. And adding on top of that, of course, we do have the problems that the Chinese government is notorious. I'll be blunt with that word. It's notorious for engaging in what we would consider bad faith, in the sense that they will take the intellectual property of another business and incorporate to themselves without necessarily giving back the royalty payments or recognition of such use of their property. We also know that they infiltrate governments and institutions through the Confucius Institute. This is no longer conspiracy theory. And these sorts of things have actually led to very delicate and even tenuous relationships, as we have seen in Australia. The trade and foreign relationships between China and Australia became very strained during the outbreak of the coronavirus, when our previous Prime Minister called for an investigation into the origins of the virus. The Chinese government actually put in trade sanctions against Australia on our exports, as well as exercising soft power in putting pressures into the institutions, such as academic institutions and even political parties, to try to pressure leaders in those institutions to walk back on their criticism of China. So these sorts of things are potential motivation for both Peru and Australia to need to look elsewhere for better trade relations, to ensure that there isn't as much, you could say, unwanted spillover effects in our in engaging trade with China, which has its benefits, but it also comes with significant costs, some of which could be long-term and unknown until we actually investigate into it deeply. So that's one of the key issues that I believe Peru and Australia need to investigate, is to look for alternative trading partners, as well as also improve on its domestic manufacturing, in order that it could replace some of the reliance that the countries have on China. Now, I believe that the advantages of that would come from the changing global trading system, where it's probably moving more towards what I'll call a regional trading bloc. So we'll talk about that after I talk about the future of energy, which is a massive challenge that the world currently faces as we speak. As I've talked about, to abruptly move out of fossil fuels is suicidal, given the heavy reliance on fossil fuels as a source of energy that the world consumes. It's also a reliable baseload energy. Now, until we move towards finding a better alternative and letting it dominate, as we can see, nuclear only takes about 8 to 10%, produces 8 to 10% of the power energy consumed, according to the World Energy, the world in data, where I downloaded this information from. Gas is increasing in its market share in producing energy. It's a cleaner form of energy, but it's still a fossil fuel, and it doesn't tick the box of a lot of environmentalists today. Even though it's funny that in European Union, in order to get through this winter, they actually have to rely on, they decided to call gas green energy. So you could see this whole clean energy thing is also a political, thing. And it's political because there is a lot of money coming from organizations that are hoping to benefit from this transition. And I am going to stick my neck out for potential criticism and for being controversial, in that I'm calling out the World Economic Forum among the many bodies for hijacking this clean energy revolution. Now, they use climate change, I believe, as a front cover, as a cover to push their policies towards their ends. And they have used the environmental sustainability, so ESG, environmental, social governance agenda, as a way to push governments and corporations to act on their act to their own benefit, because many corporations and non-government organization bodies have signed up to this type of thing. They earn tax credits in order to run their organizations as being benevolent to the world, but at the same time, the evidence body that they actually have, the evidence base that they have, is very questionable. Why do I say that? It's because the talk of global warming using carbon dioxide levels and temperature and the global temperature is not very good. It's not based on very good statistical principles. Even though you have world-renowned scientists backing this, the names, just because the names are actually backing that type of findings, doesn't necessarily mean that those findings are valid. If you actually look at it from basic statistical principles, and you look simply at the standard deviation and the significance of the results, it's not very significant. And secondly, of course, when they pushed their agenda in the 70s and 80s, they were talking about how there would be no more ice at polar ice caps, there would be no more snow in certain places. The fact that we're actually seeing we're still seeing the North Pole being mostly frozen, and there's actually snow falling in most places around the world where it ought to, and there are also snow falling in places where it hasn't snowed for a long time. You know that their science is questionable. But why can't they actually keep allowing this science to continue? It's simply because there's a lot of money coming into these institutions which are doing the research, and therefore I know for a fact in Australia, since 2007, when the universities moved into what we call research quality framework, where governments and private institutions fund research in the universities, universities started pumping out a lot of research studies that push an agenda rather than actually demonstrate good quality research that actually are consistent with the basic principles in that discipline. And this is a problem that we have to deal with, and we will have to firstly expose the hypocrisy behind those pushing the agenda, where they fly in private jets and they use fossil fuels much more than we do, but they're telling us not to use it. So that's an area which we have to deal with. I mean, the good news about Australia and Peru is we have enough resources to provide for ourselves, to not necessarily then face the international pressures, but the national leaders have to dig in and say, we're not going to follow it, and we're going to pay the costs in the short term to do it, to stand up to it until this whole movement of the climate change agenda is shown for what it is, which is not a practical or a viable solution into the future. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about, and I know that I'm stretching my time a little, is the opportunity specifically for Peru and Australia to become a stronger nation in their region and become a more prosperous nation. We are competitors in global trade. Peru and Australia are key producers of the same types of resources. We export those types of resources to other countries. So in a way, we're competing. But so when it comes to resources, we're both rich in gold. Australia comes number 2. Peru is number 6. We have the largest copper reserves. Australia and Peru takes 2nd and 3rd after Chile. And Australia has the largest zinc deposits, while Peru has the 5th largest zinc deposits. This is important. We are now moving into a world where manufacturing is going to increase. There is going to be greater demand for these metals because we will eventually move towards cleaner energy, just a different way of doing it. So these metals are going to be crucial. How do we protect our own country's competitive position and also ensure that our country prospers? And I believe rather than the world moving towards a globalization further, I think we're going to regionalize, and we're going to trade more within our global regions, our own with our neighbors. Peru has an advantage over Australia in this case because you got more than 20 countries that are within close proximity to each other. That way, there is actually lower costs in transportation, whereas Australia still has to actually ship most of our exports to our neighboring nations, given that we're an island nation. Hopefully, regional trade will improve regional cooperation, so there'll be more harmony. Like if you can foster the harmony within countries within your geographic location, improve foreign relations there, that way you would unite together and have better bargaining power when you're trading internationally with Europe, with Asia and Africa, rather than bowing to the political pressures or foreign or financial pressures from a country which is a key exporter of goods that you need. So that you will need, I believe, in the future that countries within their own regional bloc will have to specialize in manufacturing and in increasing their research and development expenditure in order to, you could say, level up in what you can produce, rather than be an exporter of raw goods and materials. You can actually be exporters of finished goods and materials. So I believe that will require quite a number of years to develop. And I believe this would lead to greater prosperity. Now, as to how likely that's going to happen, I'm quite confident that we're going to shift out of globalization and move towards localization. So if Peru and Australia can move ahead and consider this, that would be to their advantage. So in this, I believe it's a good time for me to end my presentation, and I'm going to hand it back to Professor Carlos and also the audience for any questions, and I'll try to answer it to the best of my knowledge, and where I'm not sure, I'll let you know, in order to it could be something that we could all look into and work together to look into in the future. But I appreciate your time and thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Very, very interesting. You have done a very good job reviewing the relationship between Peru and Australia and what both countries are facing in the, as you said, this changing global order. I will do some comments and perhaps some questions you can answer after I finish it, before giving space to the questions or comments that come.
Yeah.
Come from that person. Okay. Okay. First, yes, a minute, please. First, it is the tema of, you know, as you said, we are living challenging times. Besides the question that you have described, we have, as you know, this China-United States competition, economic competition, technological competition, and even some people say perhaps soon military competition. But yeah, in fact, they said there is a decoupling of the economies of China and United States. Each country, specifically United States, you know, they want to be less reliant on China, okay? So they say they are trying to form their own supply chains. And for that thing, they are taking some steps. Something, for example, that is close to Australia, they have just this Indo-Pacific economic framework, for example. No? But not only that, you know, also you said we have the competition specifically in your area, this AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, United States, or Indo-Pacific, no? So yeah, there are many questions with this. But my question is this one. Do you see, I guess you said something, but yeah, what are the opportunities for other countries? For example, in Latin America, we used to say that as United States is looking to depend less on China, perhaps some of the industries they want to probably onshoring to the United States is quite difficult because of the high cost of pricing, but perhaps they want to do some on nearshoring or friendshoring. Right? Perhaps they say that some opportunities is open to us. So that is one question anyway. And the other one related to your country, you have described the question that you have with China. Yeah, this is very interesting. China, Peru, and Australia have a very big dependence of China. In China, you have talked about the importance of not becoming too dependent in a big country. But regarding this, yes, I want to ask you something about your country. You have just elected a new prime minister, Mr. Antonio Albanese of the Liberal Party. And they said that the former prime minister, Mr. Scott Morrison of the Liberal Party, was most, conflicting with China. Do you see a change of position of Australia? Do you see better relationship between your country and China now that there is a new government? This can be one question. The other question is, China is very important. So, you know, China is probably this year is having a difficult moment. Initially, at the beginning of this year, they were saying that probably they will going to grow 5.5% annual growth, but many analysts think that that is difficult, if not impossible. Probably they said 3.3%, at least what is saying the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. But anyway, how do you see China economy from now on? And of course, you know, what will be the impact on the demand of material, especially in your country and my country that are very reliant on support of these natural resources, okay? And
so
related to this is what will be the impact specifically in the new energy? You are talking a lot about the shifting of the new energy source. We're talking about this new renewable energy of the impact of the electric car industry, for example. Really, what will be the opportunity for our countries to do that? Okay. And so one more, just to give floor to other person. You talked in your last words, you said that Peru, different with Australia, we have many countries that are our neighbors, so we can trade with that. You know, this is very interesting because, yeah, in fact, even if we share probably with many countries, even if we have many countries very near, you know, the interregional trade is very low. Is very, very low. You will be surprised perhaps to know, for example, the intra-regional trade, not only in Peru, but as an average of Latin American countries is less than 10%. Many Latin American countries, the more biggest trade partners are not them, if not other countries. Just, for example, Mexico, you know, 80% of Mexico export just go to United States. Peru, as you said, 30% go to China. So it's very interesting. You know, probably the main reason is that our countries, I mean Latin American countries, we share a similar endowment of natural resource. We don't have so much manufacturing activity, so we cannot trade each other because, as you know, in the North American market, in the Western Europe, or even with Asia, there is a loss of intra-regional trade because it is intra-industry trade, manufacturing. But in our case, Latin America, because we have a low manufacturing basis, so this is a question that we have to resolve before really having to achieve bigger interregional. But this is my question, my comments. If you want to say something, please, this, and then we'll go to the floor to another question. Okay, please go ahead.
Okay. So there are actually quite a number of questions you asked. The first one is the United States moving back towards bringing manufacturing back to itself and also trading with countries that are friendly to them and reducing reliance on China. How would that impact on the global trade. I believe that whatever the US does, the world still is going to follow in that direction. So we are going to see a lot of offshoring out of China in the coming few years, partly because of the move, what the US is doing, partly because there is a rising labor cost in China that is making manufacturing in China less attractive. We also have the COVID zero policy that has actually crippled the Chinese economy. And I believe that's going to stick around till October 26, at least at the earliest, because that's a 20th National Party Congress, where there is supposed to be it's expected that President Xi should actually have his third term, but there are nothing certain, and we know for a fact in this world a lot of things can happen in the next month. Now, how this leads to the second question that you have as to how would this impact in Australia in the context of we have a weakened, we have an increase in strained relationship with China and Australia because of former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. We got a change. We got a new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. As much as Anthony Albanese says that he's going to soften relations with China and he appears more conciliatory, I believe that there's a lot of national domestic pressures to actually not do that. So he could say one thing and he'll probably do the other. You can see it with how he campaigned for transitioning out of fossil fuels in Australia as one of his leading campaign messages. Well, look at what's happened. Our electricity bills are up. Luckily, compared to other countries, it's actually not as bad, where our electricity bills are up about 20%. He's just opening back up coal power plants and gas power plants. He knows he can't actually follow through his promise. So in terms of what we're going to see in the next couple of years, there could be improved trade relations with India. I can see that happening right now. And Southeast Asia for manufacturing, because some of the factories that are closing in China are now opening in Vietnam and also in India. And I believe that could be something that Peru might look into. But India and Vietnam are still geographically quite far away from Latin America. And that leads to the third question that answering your third question about like with Latin America, it's a small proportion. The trade between nations within Latin America is actually probably about 10%, if I heard it right. So it's not a large percentage of trade within nations inside the same continent. And shouldn't that be an opportunity in itself, where you're resource rich, and perhaps Brazil could be the new United States or China within South America? But to ensure that Brazil doesn't turn into the big villain later on, there needs to be negotiation within countries as to the exchange of technologies and the use of resources. And I believe Peru has a very strong bargaining power in this, at least from a non-expert perspective. I'm not an expert in Latin America trade, but just judging by the richness in the resources in Peru should be able to sit there and have a stronger bargaining power in saying, we will trade with you and we'll provide these primary resources for you if you actually share with us the certain technologies that allow us to improve our manufacturing capabilities. Now, the fact that Peru sends a lot of students to study in foreign universities, that's good. And I know that many of them are coming back. In fact, I got acquainted to this university through Alex Valita, who's in this presentation, because he actually studied in Australia and I got to know him, and he went back home. A lot of Chinese students, for example, they study in foreign countries, but a lot of them remain in their countries. So if Peru can provide provide incentives for people to study overseas, bring them back with the technologies and the know-how to develop the nation, I believe that could be a significant potential. And as for answering the fourth question about energy, what's the opportunity for Peru? You've got oil, you've got surplus oil to export to other nations. I believe fossil fuels is still the way for the next at least 5 to 10 years before transitioning elsewhere. The issue now is how to develop, how to have a seat at the table in moving into clean energy, especially given you are a main provider. You've got a large reserve of copper and also zinc and coal, lead, and petrol, which is necessary to transition from what we have now to a clean energy future. So if Peru has such rich resources, you gotta be able to go into the negotiation table and say, we'll provide these resources, but we actually would like to, we don't want to just be a provider, we want to also be a manufacturer, we want to take part in this. So that way they need to share the technology with you, rather than just simply take from you the resources and they then sell it back to you, the technology.
Thanks. Yeah, very interesting your answer. Just I want to point you something. Yeah, you said something among the very interesting thing that you said. You pointed that in our region we have so many countries, and you mentioned there is Brazil. In fact, it's a very big country, the most advanced economy in the region. They have a very big developed economy compared with Peru, for example. They have a very big manufacturing capacity, and as you said, we can trade more with them. But in fact, you also said something. You know, in 1960, already 2 years ago, in Latin America, there was the Latin American Free Trade Area. So we began a movement to have economic integration. But you know what happened? In the next year, there was an increase, in fact, in trade among our countries. But smaller countries like Peru, Chile, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, in 1969, they formed their own economic group and called it the Andean Pact. And one of the reasons to do that, you know what they said? They said, we are small countries, but the biggest one, not only Brazil, but Mexico, Argentina, that have a bigger economy, more manufacturing capacity, they are taking advantage of that. So that's why they began trading among them. So it's very interesting. Anyway, yeah, we have a lot of questions. Brian, I will read some of them, okay? Okay, first, from Mr. Alex Sorry, okay? I will read two questions because really we have two questions together to answer. Okay? The first said, what's going to happen with the global supply chain in the medium and long run? And another one, of course, Mr. Alex said, just about the question of Latin America becoming more interesting, having more national industry. They said, we are told that having national industry in Latin America is government interventionist in the free market. And because the danger of corruption in the private sector, we should rely on global supply chain to get what we have, what we don't have here. How can we deal with this current problem in the present global supply chain?
So this is this goes back to our what I talked about with the liberal world order there, that they were running the world. They were steering the world in terms of moving towards like nations behaving as if it's one big international community and everyone specializes in their area, and they have international bodies on top of that are above nations that tell that in a way governs what nations should do. And of course, it is not in their interest for countries to start becoming more self-reliant, because in doing so, that type of community is going to break, and the benefits that flow to these organizational bodies that actually run this liberal world order, they lose those benefits. Of course, they're going to say having national governments manage for themselves and put themselves as first priority rather than foreign trade, foreign relationships as first priority of course, they're not gonna like it, and they're gonna call interventionism similar, and it's dangerous because that goes against the interest. I agree with the fact that having national governments intervene inside the economy can cause can lead to greater corruption, because you could end up having what we call state-owned enterprise models, which you see in China, where yes, you're a government, you're a state-owned enterprise, or you're a privately owned enterprise, which is still state-owned, because the government could simply come in and say, you're not following this way, so you broke the law, we can confiscate your goods. So how do we achieve that balance? You need to, I believe there needs to be a very clear set of trading law, trade corporations law, to ensure that there is actually a protocol by which governments will allow trade to occur, and also there could be some ways to keep the governments accountable to ensure that they don't actually operate on two sets of laws where it works for them only, but it doesn't apply to the corporations and the other people. Now that how to deal with a corruption problem, that's a really tough one, because you actually need the people to put enough pressure back on the government, but the governments won't listen to people unless there is actually enough economic and financial and social pressures. So dealing with wealth equality, I believe, income equality, that might help the people have a greater power to keep the governments accountable. And in Australia, I think it's a little bit harder, because corporations actually have a lot more say than the people, even though we have elections that appear to be relatively fair. It's not. In most countries that have a voting system, it's not particularly fair. One additional point that I want to add to is property rights. That's the other thing. The reason why Australia is under a lot of pressure from China is because we have actually allowed a lot of our land to be sold to foreign investors, and therefore they, as land value goes up, they actually have more political influence, or political and financial influence. So if Peru can restrict to a certain extent sale of its land to foreigners, or at least with strings attached to ensure that you don't sell most of it, then your country is going to be able to operate more to focus on domestic interests. That this is the whole. I think this is probably the most fundamental building block of creating a country that protects itself first, and then it's able to trade with other nations on an even footing.
Interesting, Brian. Okay, another question from the Zoom group. From Ariela Ruiz, no? She said, we have seen the low volume of trade between Peru and Australia. For Peru, China is its main trading partner and United States is the second one. How is the relationship between Australia with China and with United States, I guess? How does belonging to AUKUS affect the economic relation with China?
Ooh, this is a good question, because in a way, given the last 3 years where the world has become more divided, and we are seeing a more obvious strain in the relationship between China and many countries around the world, Australia is in a very delicate position, because militarily and strategically we are aligned with the US, the UK, and also with Western powers. But in trade, there's a lot of we owe a lot to China because of our heavy, our strong, our big, massive reliance on our exports and also imports with them. How do we deal with that? China, well, firstly, the weakening of the Chinese economy will probably provide a little bit of breathing space for Australia to move back towards its doing trade and also having stronger relationship with our natural allies, which is the West. And China would not be able to put as much pressure on Australia for moving back to our natural allies. I believe Peru can probably take that opportunity as well, improve relationships with India and Southeast Asia. And depending on what happens with China and Taiwan, if China is able to be humbled through its economic weakness and also demonstrating its military weakness, maybe China would would no longer be as acting the way it currently has in placing so much pressures on other countries which don't do their bidding. So we may see some changes through the what's happening economically in China and also in the geopolitical developments.
Okay, thanks. Okay, another question from Mr. Julio Champ. He said, no country trades solely on trade. This is a truthful proposition. Conceding that the sociopolitical interference are becoming more and more relevant and intruding into the trade relationship among the realm, what is Australia doing to cope with this increasing situation? And could other countries like Peru adopt or adapt some of these action policies?
Okay, with Australia, I think China showed its hand when it decided to cut down on our on importing Australian goods in 2020 as a result of our criticism on the opaqueness of the World Health Organization in dealing with the coronavirus outbreak. And when they cut down on exports of lobsters and red wine, and I think a little bit of our coal and primary produce, but China actually showed their hand in who actually is more reliant on whom. And I think China is in a weaker bargaining position on the foreign trade than Australia is with China, especially the fact that they were cutting down on luxury goods, but they were still importing our key exports on coal, iron ore, and metals because they need it more than we actually need them. So it actually showed that if you actually stand up to them, they'll blink first. In Peru, I think the key thing to do is to review how much of your exports China reliant on as necessities, and if the Peruvian government actually postures against China and China acts in retaliation with foreign trade sanctions, look at what they do rather than what they say. If they're cutting imports on goods that are luxury goods, good to haves, rather than what they really need, then you know that Peru actually has a stronger bargaining power than China. So they will posture to say, I'm not happy with you. I'm going to buy less of this in retaliation, so you better learn your lesson. But it turns out they're still buying most of the goods that are your key exports. Then you know, Peru then would know very clearly that China is bluffing, and you called them.
Thanks, Brian. Just a question. You know, developing countries that have plenty of natural resources, and even Australia, sometimes we are facing the problem with probably you have the Dutch disease. Okay, you know, plenty of natural resource, plenty of export. We have a lot of foreign exchange, and our national currency appreciate, and our competitiveness is damaged. So what can we do regarding that? And also beside that, probably you have listened about this also problem that affect many developing countries in Africa, even in Asia and Latin America, that we have plenty of natural resource, but even in the long run, we are not going good, and even some countries are worse off. This resource course, okay, of this paradox of plenty or the poverty paradox, okay? So in the case of Australia, you have also venture capital results. How did you avoid those problems? Anyway, what one the other countries, can we learn some lesson from Australia managing this plenty of natural resource without damaging all the sectors of the economy?
Sorry, the first part of the question I didn't grab too clearly because of the connection. Would you mind just summarizing the two questions?
Yes, we have this Dutch disease. You know, in Netherlands in the 1960s, they discovered a lot of oil, gas.
Yeah.
So they began exporting a lot of this resource, and they got a lot of foreign exchange, and their national currency appreciated. So the manufacturing said they lose competitiveness because the exchange rate appreciated, really. So when a country discover or export a lot of natural resource, they have a lot of foreign exchange, and the national currency appreciates, so the manufacturing sector can have problems. So how can we avoid that? And another question is, how can we avoid this, how they call this, paradox of plenty, or the poverty paradox, having a plenty of natural resource, but in the long term, they are poorer. The case of African countries, even some American countries. How can we avoid, and what lesson can learn from Australia?
Okay, so the first question is more about how to monitor one's exchange rate stability to allow for imports, domestic production to be competitive, while at the same time, because of the world's because of the reliance on your exports, that it causes your own domestic currency to trade higher. This is a foreign exchange management question, and the way I go about this is, if you look at this is a tough one, because on one hand, to manage your foreign exchange, to manage your current account surplus, countries have, because we currently live in a petrodollar system, the foreign exchange stability is based on monetary policy from the central banks that moderate the domestic interest rates, which would affect the inflation rates and the foreign exchange. I believe the central banking system is coming to is also coming to an end, and we could move to a blockchain system. In a country where its exports, there's a surplus in exports, the way to deal with foreign reserves is either to invest back into the country on the domestic manufacturing. So the prosperity that you gain from exports, you actually invest it back in the country to improve the technology. That way, you actually you manufacture more efficiently. Thereby, while your goods might be slightly more expensive when you sell into the international market, if it is a better quality good and it's also more efficiently manufactured, people are going to demand your exports, your finished goods. So my best example, I would say, would be Japan before the Plaza Accord in the 1980s. Japan was manufacturing much of the world's electronic products after the post-World War II, as they actually improved on their, as they actually embarked on economic reform. Their goods were actually of superior quality. I guess when they first did it, Japan was like China. The goods were actually not of very good quality. But over time, as the country improved, as they became more prosperous, what happened was they actually manufactured better quality goods because they reinvested into research and development. And there was also a national pride type of thing with Japan. Japan has this. Japan is very nationalistic. They have very little immigration, so therefore their country has a very strong national identity. If Peru is able to invest back onto improving its national identity and also improving on its technological and research development, you will manufacture better quality goods. It'll be more efficient, it'll be more profitable, and it'll also be more in demand in the internationally, even though it might not appear so competitive from the exchange rate, foreign exchange perspective. That's what I'll see it as.
Thanks, Brian. Good answer. Yeah, well, we don't have to taste. We have already 1 hour and a half nearly. Last question. I will give you what should be the last question. They said, how does the constant political crisis impact future negotiation of international agreement? I mean, that is for Peru or the big countries that are very political unstable. So because Australia, I guess, don't have that much problem. But anyway, what can you say about that?
Yeah. So my understanding is that the political environment in Peru is there's more entrenched issues inside the country because of the perceived corruption of the parties that the people can actually vote for, and it's more obvious in Peru than it is in Australia. I think Australia is going to enter into a similar type of crisis because the two major parties in Australia are not really preferred by the Australian people, but because of our electoral system, where we operate on preferential voting and the two-party system, it seems like it's quite difficult to get rid of both of them in the short term. In Peru, I understand that to be a similar case. It might have a different electoral system. How does that affect foreign bargaining power and international relations? Of course, it's because the government is not necessarily negotiating with other countries on behalf of the people. It's probably more, it's acting on behalf of the larger proportion. The governments would be acting on proportion, would be acting on behalf of the donors to the party, which might be a small proportion of the population. How do you deal with that? You have to actually, you'd actually need to find a populist leader somewhere along the way. The people will actually need to voice their grievances enough in public so that they would find their own leader to break through that electoral system. And failing to do that, this would continue for quite a while. And I think Australia, we're currently only starting to voice our dissent against the government, and we are slowly finding people who are standing up and representing the people, but they now have to break through this existing electoral system, which acts against them.
Thanks, Brian. Really very interesting. Anyway, it's 1 hour and a half. I think it's a lot of time. I want to thank Brian for his very interesting conference. In fact, thanks to you, Brian, we have learned a lot about Australia. Australia, as Brian have said, which has some similarity with Peru, and especially, the rising presence of China. How to deal with this big power? Not only China. This changing international order. I think, in that sense, your presentation has been very good for all of us. I want to remember all of you that this presentation is recorded in our Facebook. You can see it anytime. So that's all for today. We hope in the future we can have again Brian Chu, perhaps in a moment that Peru and Australia have increased the relation. Yeah, our free trade area remains very new. So we hope in the following years we are going to increase more our relationship, even if we are really far away countries. But yeah, we have to learn from each other, and really we share so much. I don't know if you want to say something, final words, Brian, before finishing. That's all.
Okay. Alex, do you want to say something?
Alex, yeah. So, well, thanks to Alex, we have the presence of Brian. Please, Alex.
Yeah, I just wanna have one question right now. Yeah, it's a short time. Many people, especially Western mainstream media, says that Russia is losing the war. Okay, let's say that they are completely right, and Russia is gonna collapse next year. So what's gonna happen next? So once Russia is is completely collapsed in the next year, things will go back to normal, or what's going to happen?
Wow, this is a really tricky type of question to ask. So assuming that the mainstream media is correct and Russia is going to collapse the second time, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and they're saying that Russia is going to collapse next year. If that is the case, we have history as a prologue to see what actually happened when the Soviet Union fell in from 1989 to 1991. That the economic repercussions could be significant more for the Russian people than internationally. Europe would probably be the biggest benefactor because the collapse of Russia would likely mean that they are going to be able to pressure the Russians to export more gas or oil to them. But in my value judgment, from what I'm seeing, Russia is not losing the war. Russia isn't fighting the war that the mainstream media says they are fighting. That's why they appear to be held back by Ukraine. But if you look at it from a fourth and fifth generational warfare perspective, when you're fighting a different war against your enemy and your enemy still thinks they're fighting and something else, who's actually in advantage? So I'll leave that for the audience to think about. And I'd say if I personally would be putting my money on Ukraine actually being the one to ask for a negotiation to end the conflict, and Russia will have the stronger bargaining power. So in that case, I believe that we are going to see potentially a weakening of the European Union, and also I believe it will have a strong ramification on the ability for the West to control the setting on the price of gold and also commodities, which gives Australia and Peru massive advantages because the commodities prices could be revalued, and it will be I think it will actually deliver much more benefits to our respective countries, given that we're going to be exporting more of our natural resources and hopefully on better terms of trade.
Interesting, right? Yeah, we can discuss this question of the Ukrainian. But as you said, regarding of the outcome, it is something good for our countries. As you said, Australia and Peru, our gold, silver, perhaps can have a better effect. Okay, that will be all for today. Thanks again, Brian. Thanks again, Alexander, for making possible Brian places. And just before finishing, always when we have this event, we take a picture of all the audience. If you want to open your camera, perhaps we can have that. Yes, I will, from 1 to 5, I will count 5, and 5 I will take a picture, okay? Yes. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, thank you. Thank you
very much.
Thanks, and let's hope to see you again.
Bye-bye. Okay. See you, Brian.
Adiós, Julio.
Okay, God bless. See you later.
See you. God bless you, Brian. See you.
Bye.